Hello, everybody. We're just waiting for everyone to join and then we'll get started. Okay, I think we're there now. So, my name is Sophie Bolt. I'm the General Secretary of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. Thank you so much for joining us at this really, really important webinar looking at the impact of a nuclear attack on Faslane. So, and we felt that, with the rise of the threats of nuclear weapons being used in war accelerating now at its highest level since the Cold War. It's absolutely vital that we really raise awareness about the reality of a nuclear attack rather than some sort of abstract concept. And certainly we know that Britain's military infrastructure, like nuclear bases at Faslane and Coulport in Scotland, will be, the first targets, could be the first targets in a nuclear war, with absolutely, deadly consequences for the entire island and beyond. So we're really, really delighted to have with us here today really excellent academics and researchers. I need to say that this is a joint webinar. Really delighted to be working jointly with Scottish CND. So it's really great to have Lynn Jamieson with us, Chair of Scottish CND. But in terms of beginning this webinar, it's going to be opened by Hugh Irving, who's at the University College Dublin, and he's produced this new study, this sort of modelling, looking at as I say, the impact of a nuclear attack on the Clyde naval base at Faslane. So his research examines the potential scale of the devastation, loss of life, as well as the spread of radioactive fallout. So we're really delighted to have you with us here, Hugh. And over to you for presenting your research. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much for the introduction. Let me just share my screen here. Oh yeah. Is that all showing up okay?
Yep, that's absolutely perfect.
Thanks so much. Okay, so hi everyone, thanks so much for having me. I'm Hugh Irving. I just finished my PhD at University College Dublin earlier in the summer on wind turbine aerodynamics. And over the last few years, I've also taken an interest in scientific research advocating against nuclear weapons. And I'm here to present my most recent project in the space, simulating the effects of a nuclear attack on the Clyde Naval Base in Faslane, Scotland. So just to briefly introduce the base, all nuclear weapons and the entire fleet of nuclear armed submarines carrying these missiles are based in the Clyde Naval Base and surrounding facilities, which is only 40 kilometers from central Glasgow and is surrounded by other populated areas such as Greenock and Helensburgh. The base was constructed in the 1940s during the Second World War. 4 Vanguard nuclear armed submarines are operated from the base, at least one of which is always at sea and ready to launch its weapons. These Vanguard class submarines replaced previous Resolution class submarines carrying US Polaris missiles in the 1990s and are planned to be replaced by the new Dreadnought class submarines in the 2030s. As the UK's only nuclear weapons base, it's among the most likely targets in the UK in a nuclear exchange between NATO and Russia. Even in a relatively limited counterforce exchange, destruction of the Clyde base would be a high priority to reduce total NATO nuclear forces. Not only is the Clyde Naval Base located unusually near a major population centre, it's also located in one of the most deprived and separatist regions of the UK. The Clyde Naval Base's own council area and surrounding areas voted overwhelmingly to remain in the EU in 2016 and is one of the most pro-EU membership areas of the UK today. In the 2014 referendum on the independence of Scotland from the UK, Glasgow had the highest share of votes in favour of any council area. And Glasgow, and especially West Glasgow, is also one of the most economically challenged areas of the UK, with income and health outcomes substantially lower than UK averages. As well as being a strategic target, the base poses significant accident risks to local populations. The Clyde Basin submarine programme more broadly have experienced numerous accidents over the years. Now, reports summarising these accidents from the Nuclear Information Service called Playing with Fire covers many more of these accidents than I have here. The submarines themselves have experienced many fires and reactor-related incidents throughout their service lives. And they've also collided with other vessels, most notably in 2009, when a nuclear-armed submarine actually collided with a French nuclear-armed submarine in the Atlantic Ocean. There's also been 2 nuclear weapons loading accidents in the Clyde base, where nuclear weapons were dropped from cranes, that these were both in the 80s. Whistleblowers, including former submarine engineer William McNeely, have reported lax safety security procedures on the base, leading to frequent accidents and security breaches. The design of the Trident warheads themselves also present safety concerns, as the warheads surround the third stage fuel tank rather than being in a payload section ahead of the tank. Even UK military operational documents acknowledge the proximity of the warheads to explosive propellant as a notable potential hazard. And release of radioactive material to the local waterways through an accident or into the local atmosphere through fires is an ever-present risk for nearby residents. So, as many of you know, as a result, the Clyde Naval Base has been highly contentious for local communities and on the wider UK political stage. A continuous protest camp has been in place near the entrance of the base since 1982, despite many efforts over the years to disperse the camp. Protests remain a regular feature at the base entrance. Notably, in 2006, a year-long series of blockades was attempted at the base entrance, where 473 protesters were arrested over the course of the year. Also, major political parties oppose the base and the nuclear weapons program more generally. So, looking at some of the scientific research in this space, since the advent of nuclear weapons, there's been significant scientific interest in how these weapons affect human populations. This was both from military organizations as well as scientists in civil society, often advocating for disarmament. Most relevant to my own work are studies by Professor Sebastian Philippe on the radiological effects of nuclear weapons and modeling dispersion of fallout. These studies have looked at the damaging effects of fallout dispersion to local populations due to testing on attacks in various regions. These studies have in some cases been instrumental to various advocacy efforts, such as advocating for recognition and reparation for the damaging effects of French nuclear testing in Polynesia. And many aspects of my work on the Clyde base is derived from these studies. So the scenario I chose to examine in my study is a strike on the Clyde base's associated Coolport armament depot. An explosive yield of 100 kilotons was chosen. This is the yield of several relevant Russian weapons listed here. It's also the same explosive yield of the UK's own naval warheads, so results could give some idea of the potential human cost of UK nuclear use. The weapons are stored in underground concrete reinforced bunkers, which require a ground burst or detonation at ground level to destroy them, as opposed to an airburst, which is used to destroy cities, and you might be familiar with from accounts of the nuclear bombing of Japan. I'm sort of labouring this point as ground bursts produce much more fallout and project this radioactive material high into the atmosphere, where it can be dispersed widely by winds. This is a particular concern for attacks on the Clyde base, as there are nearby cities and high local wind speeds. Also, a 2-on-1 strike was simulated, where the target is struck by 2 weapons. This is a well-known strategy in nuclear targeting of high-priority targets, as weapons can fail or be intercepted. Modelling the humanitarian effects of this scenario requires a series of interacting models. Both the short-term effects of the weapon and fallout effects were modelled. The models are controlled by a tool called Nuclear War Simulator, created by Ivan Stepanov. The short-term effects include blast pressure, thermal radiation, and prompt radiation, which are modeled as distance-dependent fatality curves. The fallout effects are calculated using a different method, using a tool called high split, which is distributed by the American National Ocean and Atmospheric Administration. This tool uses Lagrangian fluid mechanics methods to model how a plume of particles representing the fallout in the mushroom cloud is dispersed by the wind and lands on the ground or ocean surface. A deposition map is created from this, on which percentages of long and short-term fatalities due to fallout exposure are imposed. The short-term effect radii and the fallout deposition pattern are then mapped onto the EU's Copernicus population density map, giving a total number of casualties. A protection factor is also applied to the population based on urbanization data to model the protective effect of sheltering indoors. The short-term doses are integrated over 96 hours or 4 days to take into account realistic evacuation procedures. And the long-term dosages are integrated over a full year with a provision for population evacuation if the radiation dose is above a pre-specified level. So this flowchart gives a simplified illustration on how the different models interact. The left side shows the flow of information for modeling the immediate effects of the blast, and the right shows the flow of information when modeling casualties due to fallout. Some adapting of the modeling techniques found in Sebastian Philippe's work was necessary, such as adjusting the protection factors applied to the fatality curves. This is because a much higher proportion of UK homes are made from brick, which is more protective from radiation, but mostly do not have basements, which can be used to shelter before evacuation. Weather data from June 2019 to present was used, as this data set is available at high resolutions. And I ran 100 simulations, all with different historical weather conditions and with all other factors remaining the same. Randomized dates and times were chosen from historical data to give adequate statistics on potential casualties. So, for example, this figure shows the fallout dispersion for the historical weather condition with the highest number of fatalities out of the 100 simulated. We can see the fallout being dispersed to the southeast over central Glasgow, and small amounts even reaching as far as Newcastle, resulting in a total of 138,827 fatalities. Over 99% of the fatalities in these conditions are from exposure to fallout, resulting in short-term casualty from radiation sickness and long-term casualties due to cancer. Just under 800 fatalities are a result of the initial detonation, and this remains constant between simulated weather conditions. This map shows the maximum fallout radiation dose from all simulations. So at each location, the color represents the maximum radiation dose observed in any one of the 100 simulations overlaid over population data. So we can see large doses of radiation potentially reaching Glasgow and surrounding population centres such as Greenock, Paisley, Stirling, Edinburgh and Dundee. In a few cases, significant fallout is spread to Aberdeen and Newcastle. Smaller doses are spread all over the region, reaching as far as the English Midlands, the Isle of Man, Northern Ireland, and the Republic of Ireland. Very little of this fallout reaches mainland Europe in any of the simulated conditions, with very small amounts landing in France and Norway in some cases. And this map shows the number of simulations out of the 100 ran, that a dangerous dose of over 100 millisieverts is spread to each location across simulated weather conditions. So we can think of this as a map of the likelihood that any one location receives a dangerous dose. Similarly to the previous map, we see that nearby population centres receive a dangerous dose a high proportion of the simulations, especially population centres east of the base. Across simulated weather conditions, we see strong variations in potential fatalities. So as the same detonation point was used in all 100 simulations, all of this variation is due to differences in local weather conditions across simulations. So the distribution has a long tail, with a small number of simulations having very large fatality counts when the fallout is dispersed over surrounding densely populated areas. Other quantities related to weapon effects, such as the minimum fallout affected land area that would have to be evacuated, was calculated. And this is usually in the order of thousands of square kilometers. Also, the proportion of simulations in which a dangerous radiation dose of at least 100 millisieverts was deposited on local population centers was calculated. This proportion represents the likelihood of radiation exposure in a strike. So population centers that were closer or which are more often downwind from the base have higher likelihood of radiation exposure, with Glasgow receiving a dangerous radiation dose in 27% of simulations. I also looked at the proportion of simulations in which key infrastructure, such as nuclear energy sites and freshwater sources, received dangerous radiation doses. As I'm sure you can imagine, evacuation of nuclear energy sites due to radioactive contamination could lead to enormous operational risks at these already strained facilities. Scotland, of course, is famous for its abundance of fresh water, and exposing these large drinking water sources to radiological contamination would likely cause water shortages and potentially widespread radiation exposure far beyond the fallout affected areas. While the likelihood of each individual site being contaminated is generally 20% or below, the cumulative likelihood is much higher, illuminating the disastrous downstream effects of these attacks. I also looked at what further key civil infrastructure, such as major airports, seaports, and power stations, would be affected. Evacuation and equipment contamination at these facilities would disrupt supply chains, food availability, and medical care. Scotland and Northern England are important industrial and logistics hubs, with many more industrial, agricultural, medical, and transport facilities that can be counted in this study. Many of these facilities would be inoperable due to radiation exposure in such a strike, exacerbating humanitarian issues far beyond the area immediately surrounding the base. This work aims to demonstrate in a scientifically rigorous, yes, yet accessible way, the humanitarian consequences of a nuclear strike on the Clyde naval base. There's some familiarity with the blast effects of weapons among the public and policymakers from the historical significance of the nuclear bombing of Japan, but people are much less aware of the far-reaching risks related to fallout due to ground-burst strikes, which in a case like this will usually make up the vast majority of fatalities. This work illustrates the risk that high-value strategic targets, such as the Clyde base, pose to local populations, especially when they are built so close to major population centres as the Clyde base is. So, thanks so much for listening and for having me.
Thank you so much, Hugh. A huge amount to take in there, and also, yes, terrifying, really. But as I say, this is what we need to know, isn't it? So thank you so much. Before I go to Rhys, I just want to remind everybody on this webinar, we've got 132 people, that if you would like to ask questions, which you're very welcome to, or put forward your views, you can do that either through the Q&A. We've got a Q&A. So I see people are already starting to use that. So that's good. The Q&A, yeah, questions would be brilliant. To flag that up. And once we've heard from Rhys and Lynn, we will then open up for the Q&A. Okay. So thanks again so much, Hugh. Really, really important research. So I'm now going to move on to Rhys Crilley. He's a lecturer in international relations at the University of Glasgow, and he's also author of the Unparalleled Catastrophe, Life and Death in the Third Nuclear Age. So great to have you with us. Yes, over to you for some more probably very stark research.
Thanks so much, Sophie. Can you hear me and see me okay? And see the slides? Excellent.
All good.
Fantastic. Yeah. Wow. Good evening, everyone, and thanks so much for the invite to speak to you today. Yeah, it's some task to follow Hugh, and I live in Glasgow, and I'm here right now, and yeah, it's quite a lot to take in just before giving a talk. So thank you, Hugh, for sharing that research. But yeah, of course, as Hugh demonstrated, we're living in dangerous times because, as Sophie said at the start, the risk of nuclear weapons being used or nuclear war breaking out have returned to heights not seen since the Cold War. And as Hugh has shown, that would be extremely catastrophic for Scotland. So this current era that we're living in of increased dangers and risks is often referred to as a new or third nuclear age. And this term has gained considerable traction in academic and policy circles, with analysts drawing attention to the increasing complexity of contemporary nuclear politics. And when we talk about this third nuclear age, these academics and experts and policymakers, they point out that the era that we're living in is different to earlier nuclear ages that have come before, because now we see the emergence of multipolarity and great power competition, tensions between and conflicts involving nuclear armed states ranging from Ukraine to Iran. We see emerging and disruptive technologies and the collapse of long-standing arms control treaties. So there's all this horrible stuff going on. And yet, despite these growing and diverse dangers, the response from nuclear armed states has been remarkably consistent. They argue that because the world is becoming more dangerous, nuclear weapons have therefore become more necessary. So a recent paper that a colleague and I have published in the journal International Affairs explores what the rise of this third nuclear age means for nuclear disarmament efforts. And here we set out to do some research, and we were essentially interested in asking, how are governments talking about nuclear disarmament in the context of the third nuclear age? So I thought Hugh and Lynn would give expert overviews of the impacts of a nuclear strike on Scotland. So I thought I'd kind of step back a bit and take a look at what's happening at the diplomatic level and how states are talking about disarmament. And the study we did, we looked at how we analysed over 100 statements made by governments at recent non-proliferation treaty meetings to see how they talked about things related to this third nuclear age, whether that's geopolitical competition or arms control collapsing, etc. And we looked at how they mentioned disarmament in this context. And we've got three main findings that I think are important to talk to you about today. So the first is that nuclear weapon states and their allies have developed a remarkably consistent narrative about our contemporary moment, where despite their differences, the nuclear weapon states all focus on growing geopolitical rivalry as the defining feature of this third nuclear age. And this development is repeatedly used to argue that now is not the time for nuclear disarmament. Instead, the governments of nuclear weapon states essentially say, we all want a world without nuclear weapons, but first we need a better security environment, and until then, we must modernise our arsenals and strengthen nuclear deterrence. Disarmament therefore becomes something permanently deferred. It's always the goal, but it's never actually the tangible policy. And this creates what Professor Benoit Pelopaides at Sciences Po in Paris calls nuclear eternity, the sense that nuclear weapons and the crises of today will always exist because the conditions for eliminating them never quite arrive. And the second finding is that this dominant story about the third nuclear age leaves out something incredibly important, because if you only listen to nuclear weapon states, you think that our contemporary world is entirely defined by confrontation, crisis, and conflict. And of course, there are huge crises and horrific conflicts involving nuclear weapon states taking place today, but that's only half the story. Because at exactly the same time as the crises that define this third nuclear age have come into being, we've seen the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons enter into force and gain the support of a global majority of states. So now, across the world, a majority of states reject nuclear weapons and want to see them eliminated. And there's now a legally binding treaty that commits these states to that end. Alongside that, we've seen growing participation in nuclear disarmament advocacy by states and civil society. We've seen a renaissance of prominent media and culture that draws attention to the harms of nuclear weapons. And we've seen scientific cooperation in understanding the harms of nuclear war and risks. And a plethora, growing expertise and research like Hugh's that really dives into, okay, what would the use of nuclear weapons look like? But what I'm trying to get at here is that, in other words, the third nuclear age is not only an age of renewed nuclear competition, it's also an age of renewed global cooperative efforts towards nuclear disarmament. And the problem is that these developments are rarely treated as defining features of the time and the era that we're living through. And perhaps our most surprising finding concerns states that support nuclear disarmament and the TPNW, because whilst these states strongly defend the treaty and argue that today's dangers make disarmament more urgent, they often describe it as something that's outside of the third nuclear age, rather than something that actually helps define it. And I think this matters because if disarmament is always presented as existing outside of today's strategic reality, it risks appearing as sort of separate from real security politics. And the argument here, therefore, is that current nuclear disarmament efforts and things like the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons are not external to this third nuclear age. They're one of the defining political developments that's happening in it. So what does this mean, to wrap up, for those of us campaigning and those of us who want nuclear disarmament? I think there's three implications. The first is that we shouldn't concede this language of the third nuclear age to those that argue for more nuclear weapons. The term doesn't have to belong to nuclear strategists and people that advocate for deterrence. And second, when people say that we're entering a more dangerous world, we can agree. But we can remind them that this is exactly why nuclear disarmament is needed, and it's also why the global majority of states now support the abolition of nuclear weapons. And third, I think we can tell a fuller story that captures the big picture. The third nuclear age isn't simply a story of rivalry, conflict, and arms racing, because when you look beyond the great powers and the nuclear weapon states, it's also a story of effective activism, of legal commitments by a majority of states to never develop nuclear weapons and work towards abolishing those that do exist. It's a story of diplomatic and scientific and civil society cooperation, of survivors' voices being heard, of people being mobilized and growing international support for eliminating nuclear weapons. And I think if we leave those developments out of the story, we unintentionally reinforce that idea that nuclear deterrence is the only realistic security strategy for today's world. And of course, to wrap up, the third nuclear age involves very real, very present, and very terrifying dangers, but it also involves a new momentum for disarmament. And I think the challenge for us is to harness that momentum and shift the debate to change policy and work towards a world without nuclear weapons. So thank you very much for listening. And yes, Sophie mentioned the book, and I thought I'd just mention it again. But if you're interested in kind of a critical perspective on this third nuclear age, then please do take a look. Thanks so much.
Brilliant. That was really, really helpful. And also, as well as being, very stark and rightly kind of pointing out all the challenges we face. Also, I think it's so important, isn't it, to be reflecting the positive development, especially in relation to the critical role of the sort of the global South in terms of sort of leading the disarmament movement, which is really, really critical. And also, reflecting the kind of shifting global dynamics, which mean that there is actually, I think, sort of more space for for voices speaking up for nuclear disarmament across the world. So thank you very much. So I'm now going to move on to our final speaker, Lynn Jamieson. Chair, here you're speaking as Scottish CND chair, but a very well-established academic in your own right. So I think you will also be presenting some research too. So thank you, Lynn, and great to have you with us. You're muted.
Can you see my slides okay?
There's a little bit of sort of, for some reason, we've got a bit of the, that's better now. But I think if you put it on screen share, it should be, on slideshow, it should be all right now.
Is that okay? Yes?
Yes, that's very good. Thank you.
So sorry. Okay, so yes, I'm going to start just with reminding you about some Cold War material. So these slides came from Duncan Campbell, the investigative journalist, and they're about people in Scotland working with United Kingdom Warning and Monitoring Organisation during the Cold War, just to remind us how bad it was and could still be, and that we, although we're now in a very critical third, as Rhys calls it, third nuclear age, it was pretty bad during the Cold War too. So This is showing how many targets there were imagined to be in Scotland. Well, not imagined, but the scenarios that they practiced when they were hiding in their bunkers and expecting to have to mark up maps of radiation because Scotland had suffered a nuclear strike. This showing you that there are multiple expected targets in these scenarios, and that there would be multiple strikes around the Clyde area that would actually result in the flooding of Glasgow, because they would have included an underwater strike on the Clyde. But also there were many other targets in Scotland. The secret declassified documents show that they were expecting multiple bursts on particular targets, and particularly, of course, Faslane and Coalport, and that they would expect things to get worse and worse as the days progress, that there would be no realistic services that could respond, because the healthcare services, all the kind of first responders would all be destroyed, and so all the hospitals and so on. So it was incredibly grim, and this is the bunker in Dundee where they were mapping the fallout, which has been reconstructed and is now open to the public. But this is a map from the time of fallout arrays all over Scotland. It's been reconstructed by this man, George Alford, and Duncan Campbell's interviewing him, visiting him. And anyone can now go there and look at this. So the third nuclear age, as Rhys said, has been one as well that has been all about the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And so just to remind you that, there are now 100 states that are either signatories or have fully ratified that treaty, that it acknowledges things that were never acknowledged before, that the disproportionate impact has been on women and girls and on the Indigenous peoples around the world because of where the colonial powers like the United Kingdom did their nuclear testing, and that it obliges assistance to victims in remediation of contaminated environments. Now, these are things that the nuclear states, of course, have never acknowledged or picked up. And even to today, despite the relentless campaign of lab rats, there's been great reluctance on the part of our government to acknowledge the harms that were done to British servicemen, never mind Indigenous peoples in Australia or the Pacific. But we, in our work, can do a lot around the existence of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And in Scotland, we just recently had an election which brought back again a majority of members of our parliament who would be prepared and will be prepared. Some of them have already signed what's called the Parliamentary Pledge, a pledge signed by ICANN for parliamentarians saying that they support the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So that in Scotland, we're in this fortunate situation of the majority of our Scottish Government representatives being people who've either signed or will sign the ICANN Parliamentary Pledge. But that doesn't mean that they do everything that they can to speak out about the harms, and it's up to us as lobbyers to help keep them alive and doing as we would wish them to. And as local activists, we can be present at the events around Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which local CND groups, the length and breadth of the United Kingdom, always hold. We can do what we can to support those. We can do what we can to visit Faslane and Lakenheath when vigils are organised, when events and campaign activities are organised. But at a very everyday level, we have to just keep calling out and talking, not just to our representatives, but in every forum that we can, that we have the courage to educate ourselves, to talk to friends and family. As Rhys was saying about the magical thinking of deterrence and nuclear security, the nonsense that is. And also, I would say the links in Scotland, there's new pressure towards nuclear power, but the links between nuclear weapons and nuclear power, it's important to understand and to call out, along with the astronomical cost of nuclear weapons and those everyday risks and harms that Hugh was pointing out in his talk. Not the leaks, the threats of accident, the accidents that there have been and that might be, the nuclear convoys that come up and down our roads, and to remember that all of this is implicating us in the USA's own nuclear warfighting strategy under the leadership of Donald Trump, that the UK nuclear weapon is not a UK nuclear weapon in any straightforward sense. There's Rhys, the Trident missiles from the United States. So there's lots of everyday things that we can be doing. I'm going to stop there, Sophie. I'm not sure whether I'm out of time or not.
Okay, I think you're pretty much just on time. So thanks, Lynn. Yes, I mean, part of the purpose of this webinar is we will definitely be circulating these PowerPoint presentations, and also we are recording this webinar, so you will have an opportunity to kind of watch it back and absorb all this information. So we're not expecting you necessarily to have sort of absorbed it all now to be able to ask all the questions that you want to. But it's really as a kind of a reference as well. But it's also to kind of galvanize us, isn't it, in terms of why we've got to kind of redouble our efforts to kind of build a global majority against nuclear weapons. So as I say, thank you so much to all our really, really excellent presentations. I'm now going to go to some of the questions that we've had, and I'll sort of throw them out there for you, and you can decide which ones you'd like to answer. I've just seen somebody with their hand raised. So Joan, you will need to type your question into either the chat or the Q&A, because unfortunately I can't sort of take you to speak. Okay then. So the first is a question to Hugh from Peter Gloin saying, Hugh, can you comment on the likely influence of the assumption of the level of exposure that would be hazardous? Some say that there is no safe level of exposure to radiation. So if you want to take that question, then I'll look at some others.
Yeah, of course. And thanks so much to the speakers. I found your talks very interesting. Yeah, so the radiation dosing model is based on previous literature on sort of the medical effects of exposure to radiation. And so in the case of my models, there's at certain thresholds, there are percentages of the affected population that are assumed to have the sort of short-term casualty or like long-term casualty effects. And then this is integrated over time. So of course, the radiation dosing isn't an instantaneous value, but it's a value that builds over time. Which if you have been involved in any kind of medical imaging, CAT scans and X-rays and things like that, you might be aware that there's limits to how many of those you should receive, like over the course of a month or a lifetime, etc. So the assumptions for lower doses of radiation from the medical field, as far as I understand, are fairly well known. I think for higher doses of radiation, it's difficult to get such wide population data. So it's probably actually at the higher radiation dosing levels that you see larger amounts of uncertainty, rather than at the very sort of low levels, as sort of like is implied by the question. But I don't know, I hope that sort of sheds some light on how it's sort of calculated in this case. But of course, radiation exposure is something that we should all be sort of aware of in terms of like medical imaging and things like that.
Okay, thank you. I'm now going to ask a couple of questions that are sort of related, and then a very specific one about Rosyth. So these are sort of in relation to, like, what can we do about government policy. So the first one is how can we effectively advocate for the de-escalation from this mad militarization of the Labour government, hell bent on the Trident replacement projects? How can we turn the super tanker around? The super tanker currently helmed by the military industrial corporations. So that's one. And then the other is, just sort of quoting our new Defence Secretary, Wes Streeting, who's sort of basically sort of saying, that his job is to maximise our deterrence, to ensure that if deterrence should fail, we have capacity to fight and win. And then he's talking about that means investment. So why, Britain has to massively continue to sort of increase its military spending, and as Streeting kind of talks about it, to carry a greater share of the burden for our own defence. There's a lot there to unpack, which I hope you can do, because this whole notion of defence has really got to be taken up. So yes, really to kind of comment on the sort of the trajectory, the continued trajectory of our kind of current governments in relation to nuclear weapons. So I'm opening that up to to Rhys and Lynn. I don't know which you'd like to take. Lynn?
Okay, so on the turning the tanker around, I mean, our media are part of the problem, of course, because they don't critically ask or ever really seriously pose alternatives, nor do they give us an equal voice. I don't even mean just the peace movement, but I mean, there are military personnel, former military senior people who don't support the level of spending on nuclear weapons, or in fact don't even really believe in the nuclear deterrence, but would rather see the spending on other military things. But they don't get much voice in the media. They never get sought out by the media. We're not getting asked to comment, and nor are they. But I actually think, if you think about Scotland before the referendum in 2014, I mean, the proportion of people who supported independence seemed to be quite small. And then, it became within 10% on the day. And that was when absolutely everything was thrown against it. I actually think out there is a lot of understanding about the absurdity of nuclear weapons. But the idea that we all support it can be kind of still perpetuated, like as if that's a majority view, when in fact it isn't. I don't believe it is. So it's certainly not in Scotland. But it doesn't. We're not managing to get that high profile enough. I mean, basically, never give up, and every single way of campaigning must continue. Is all I can say. But Rhys, do you have something else that you would want to add?
Yeah, thanks, Lynn. Yeah, I agree with that. I think that perhaps there's an opportunity, right? If the new Burnham government is a cost of living government, as he's kind of said it is, the cost of living crisis can it be really addressed when you're spending so many billions on nuclear weapons, and you're committed to spending that over, for the foreseeable future, right? Because the billions that we're spending on the nuclear program comes at not only the expense of kind of the conventional military equipment that many in the military want, but also at the expense of the things that society needs, right? Education, hospitals, health, a good standard of living for all of us. So maybe that can be something that we can really leverage. And yeah, I'm not optimistic that there'll be too much of a shift away from the sort of military Keynesianism, like whole of society approach of the Starmer government. But I think, if Andy Burnham is focused on this being a government that is tackling the cost of living crisis, the direct question is then, okay, why is the state still spending so much money on these things that, are never going to be used? So yeah, I think that's what I'd add there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that I think things are definitely shifting in terms of people's fears of nuclear weapons, and I think we've seen that through the horrific Ukraine war, and I think that this sort of attempt to kind of whip up fear to get people to kind of support or feel that they have no alternative but to support these massive increases in military spending. It is kind of not actually showing itself in terms of support for increases in military spending. If you sort of consistently there, poll after poll after poll shows that if people are presented with the choice between increase in military spending at the detriment of health spending, people will not accept it. And there's been this huge, obviously, like there's a massive campaign to try and kind of overturn that, but even still, the figures are still very low in terms of support. So I think that that is really critical, but also what the government's been trying to do is to sort of because they can't cut through on just the straightforward, let's just cut, public spending, is to argue that this will massively increase jobs. This is going to kickstart the economy. And so, CND's very, very much promoting the work of, organisations like the Transition Security Projects, which have done really important research, basically sort of analysing the costs around the defence investment plan, which is to say we all know that that is being funded by certainly to start with over £7 billion worth of cuts, capital spending cuts to all other departments, and then there will be another 4.7 billion that will need to be found. And their research is showing that because of these cuts to critical public services like transport, health, education, which are far more jobs rich. When you kind of look at like the amount of investment that you would put in, every sort of £1 million worth of investment, and you look at like the number of jobs that creates for military procurement, it's right at the bottom. And that's because overwhelmingly, they're buying very, very expensive kit. There's very small amount of labor, but also overwhelmingly, that money is going to private arms companies and to their shareholders. So, this is not going to create the wealth that the government is talking about, and it's not going to create, these all these jobs that we need. So this continuation is going to see a continuation of this sort of political crisis of this government unless it changes course, which it totally has to do. But also, we're now living with the extreme weather, of climate change. You cannot deny it now. And we know that, for instance, there are about, I think, nearly 3,000 people were killed, died, sorry, between, May and June because of the extreme weather. And that's just over, 2 months. And so, this is a situation where the government has chosen to take some of the biggest cuts from net zero, from these capital spending programs like retrofitting homes, which is all about insulating homes. So on the one hand, they're much cooler in the summer and they're much warmer in the winter. So on both levels, we're seeing a situation where we're having excess deaths, either from, older people who are dying because they're too cold, or now babies, children, older people dying because of this terrible kind of heat wave. And and again, we've got completely the wrong priorities being put forward because of this sort of military spending project. So it's really critical, and we're all doing this work, I know, to be linking up with trade unions, with the climate movement, to be sort of saying this is only going to accelerate all of these crises. We have the answers, we have the solutions. If you take this 300 billion that's going to be spent over the next 4 years and you put that into public services and properly, put that into very sort of strategically targeted areas in terms of investment, you can sustainably kind of grow the economy, and sort of tackle climate change and lift people out of poverty. And when we're in a situation where it's not just the climate change that we're facing, but also this looming global recession because of the ongoing blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, to me, it's like it's just completely reckless and makes absolutely no sense at all why you would be, just putting all of this, money into militarism, which is just going to further kind of escalate these problems. So yes, and that's how we can help build this kind of majority against nuclear weapons. It's taking people with us. Not everybody is at the point where they get, why nuclear weapons are not, don't keep them safe and all of this, but they're really, really struggling with the cost of living and they're paying their bills and all that sort of stuff. So that's really, really important. Okay, so I'm now going to move on to next question, which now I've got to find it. Sorry, let me just find this question, which was very good. Here we go. Oh, I'm really sorry about this. It's disappeared. Somebody maybe answered it. Let me just find
I
it.
can understand if you answer them, they might disappear. So I accidentally might have made something disappear.
You did. Okay.
So
Yes, you have.
Brian, you know all about.
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah,
Brian, I'm sorry, I tried to type in a website that
Okay. Well,
allows you to.
that's fine. Let me just, yeah.
Sorry.
Let me. Do you mind answering it kind of
Yes,
like
you do it. Sorry.
in a real?
Yes, sorry.
So this is a question from a Rosyth councillor, saying that the UK government has confirmed without any public consultation that Rosyth Dockyard will become a contingency dock for the Dreadnought submarines when they arrive before Faslane is ready for them. Has or will any modelling be done on the impact of a strike there? So, Lynn, would you like to
sorry,
respond to
Brian.
this?
I was trying to say, to my knowledge, there's not been explicit modelling, and of course, it's disgraceful that this has been decided without any consultation. But there is a website where you can put in any location and see what the effects of a strike were. But of course, it's assuming that this location is not a nuclear armed location and there are not nuclear facilities there that are going to be exploded by a nuclear strike. So you will only get the fallout and blast and so on effects of what a certain nuclear weapon would be on that site, without factoring in the fact that it might have nuclear armed submarines sitting at that site. So yes, it's a very, very serious issue.
Thanks. Okay. we've now got another direct question for Hugh. This is from Samuel. So he's saying, your scenario involves a strike of two 100 kiloton bombs on the Coolport bomb bunkers. Are there any additional effects caused by the fact that this is where so much of the UK's own nuclear stockpile is stored? So yeah, would you be able to have a go at that, Hugh?
Yeah, of course. So I think it's a very good question. It's kind of getting at two aspects of the modeling. So both of which are sort of opaque and there's a lot of uncertainties related to. So firstly, sort of the targeting strategies, and that sort of in this case, sort of a Russian war planner would have sort of conceived for a strike like this, or it's very opaque. It's very difficult to tell exactly what weapons, looking at the Russian stockpile, would be applied to a base like this, especially with the Russian stockpile, because it's very, if you're familiar, it's very large and has lots and lots of different yields and ranges compared to something like the UK stockpile, which is sort of very concise and has like only, one type of weapon. So And in Lynn's presentation, we saw sort of from some of the Cold War era modeling, these sort of much larger weapons, these 1 megaton weapons that could conceivably have been applied at the time. And there's thought that as weapon accuracy has increased so much, that these weapons, that the weapon yields used to destroy these strategic targets will be smaller. And with these new dial yield weapons, which you may or may not be familiar with, where weapon yield can be reduced, there's sort of thought that smaller sort of more in these sort of tens of kiloton range weapons could be applied to these targets. And sort of the only solid data to go on is sort of inferring what these strategies might be just from looking at Russian stockpiles, which are itself are very uncertain. The information on these are very uncertain, and the sort of public information. So sort of this is a best guess estimate of what would be used on a single site. This is for partially for practical reasons because because of limitations in computational hardware and so on. A single strike is much more straightforward to model than sort of a series of multiple strikes across the UK. For various reasons in terms of like the size of the domain in which you're simulating the particle movement and so on. So this is sort of one layer of sort of uncertainty and opacity in the models. And then a second layer, which you're touching on here, is that if there's a strike on a nuclear facility, we have the possibility that some of the fissile material that's struck could itself contribute to radiation exposure or fallout and that kind of thing. And there's even talk in some parts of the literature of a term called popcorning, where you'd have bunkers, you'd have strikes on bunkers causing sort of successive fission events in the stored weapons. So sort of the layers of uncertainty with that are quite wide. In my own research, I can only, because the weather conditions are so chaotic and they're sort of the main variable affecting casualties, I have to be sort of quite narrow in the scenarios that I model. So there's maybe a distribution of different outcomes to an event like this, but I can only sort of model one. And sort of the most sort of like defensible from a sort of academic literature standpoint is to is not to look at these sort of follow-on effects from the weapon, because there's so much uncertainty with the storage and how these would work operationally. I think there could be good modeling work done in this regard in terms of fissile material making it into waterways. I think there you could see sort of make sort of slightly more defensible assumptions in terms of amount of fissile material there. But sort of for these sort of atmospheric related events, it's sort of difficult to sort of narrow down the scenarios if you're sort of taking all of these things into account. So I hope that like goes some way to address the question, for example, which is a very good one. And it's good to touch on these things that, in fact, even the same strike could have much larger effects on populations.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Hugh. I'm just going to read out a statement and then I'm going to ask you all another question. So this is from Robert Kinnell. He says, I was partly responsible for nuclear weapons security at RAF Greenham Common for 2.5 years, RAF Bruggen in West Germany, and introduced the NATO WS3 storage in... Now, I don't know what HAS stands for, but you'll have to write that in, Robert, to RAF Honningen. I resigned and left the RAF in 2003 as I do not agree with the UK having nuclear weapons. So I just want to say thank you, Robert, for sharing that with us. And well done. That's really wonderful, and I hope you're now part of our very, very broad and very important movement. Okay, now the question I'm going to ask you all is around this another kind of awful development, which is around the Defence Universities Alliance, which you might have all heard about, which is this part of the work that the government's doing around trying to harness this kind of whole of society approach to this war preparation and war economy. So it's this very kind of parasitic relationship between the Ministry of Defence and higher education, where now we have, I think it's 35 universities have signed up to this Defence Universities Alliance, which effectively means it's arms companies will have access to university laboratory facilities, and to, the brightest and the best doing, research, to help, develop and research, different types of weaponry. I mean, we know, for instance, already that at University of Sheffield, the Advanced Manufacturing Research Unit there is working with the atomic weapons establishment to develop the new nuclear warhead, so we know that that's already going on. So this isn't sort of new, we know that like arms companies are already funding research, across the higher education sector, but this is kind of formalizing it, isn't it? And so I suppose it's like, yeah, your comments on that, this is a very, very profound, very, very serious challenge to higher education. So yeah, I think all of you, I'm sure, will have views on this. So if I go first to you, Lynn.
Students are already quite skilled at campaigning around divestment and have been very effective on some campuses at getting divestment from military that was implicated in Gaza, at the bombing of Gaza by Israel and with complicity of the United States and to some extent this country as well, of course. So the divest, Don't Bank on the Bomb have been doing an excellent job trying to expose who is investing in nuclear weapons. Scrutiny of university activities has had effects in the past, but of course they're also strapped for cash, desperate for money, happy to take money from dirty sources, it seems. So, but students can protest about it. So I think that's a way to go, just trying to speak to student bodies through organisations like People and Planet or whatever local organisations we know about in universities near you. I know I tried to raise this in my own university, but without hoping that they wouldn't do this. But they are on the list of my own university, on the list of universities that are taking this money, which is very disappointing.
Okay, thanks, Lynn. Rhys?
Yeah, so the Defence Universities Alliance, I think higher education in the UK is in crisis essentially, and universities are desperate for funding. What I think is really like bonkers is that when you read the Defence Universities Alliance kind of document that they've shared, the FAQ or whatever, there's no funding commitment involved. So it's not that there's a sort of like a promise that there's not even a promise of funding. It's like maybe in future members of the alliance will have advantageous access to funding, but there's no numbers or kind of strict commitment in there. So it's kind of shocking. And I know that trade unions and many staff at my university and other universities and students as well are worried about what this means, about how it means the university becomes something that is entirely or like very, very focused on doing war-related research at the expense of working on other things that are more important to Scottish, British, kind of European, global society. It also funnels graduates into jobs with companies that do awful things, and it essentially limits the rights of students and staff to protest on certain things, because there's a clause in there. Let me just try and find it, which basically says, oh, I've lost it. But it basically says that universities have to ensure that the military and defence firms have access to campus for careers fairs and things like that. So it's kind of scary stuff, and it goes completely against what the majority of staff and students at many universities want. I know at Glasgow in 2025, the SRC, the student kind of representative body, they did a survey of students to see, oh, what do you think about the university investing in the arms trade? And the response was overwhelmingly that students wanted the university to divest from the arms trade. The university itself did a staff and student survey of all staff and students at the university in, I think it was late 2024, to see what staff and students thought about investing in the arms trade. And again, that was overwhelmingly clear that people didn't want the university to be investing in the arms trade. So yeah, I think it's quite a strange thing that universities have kind of committed to. I think it seems to be that they think there's going to be funding attached, but it seems that it's going to limit them, and there's no actual money there. So yeah, I think it's not something that I'll be involved in.
Now that's a surprise, Rhys. Thank you.
But yeah, I think it's the same for many staff as well. I think people are that this isn't something that the majority of people really want to do. It's kind of coming top down.
Hugh.
Yeah, so I'd agree wholeheartedly with the previous two speakers. Military and defense money coming into public research is sort of, for the reasons outlined previously, is a huge issue, especially when the student bodies are so important for opposition to, or such an important population for opposition to these military endeavors, and you have students signing sort of secrecy agreements and so on because they've touched on some topic that is related to military research, and it's sort of an overreach of control on their voice publicly. We can see, sort of, if we look to the US, which is sort of a little bit further along in its entanglement between defense contractors and public research, they have this huge number of national labs, in which are of course classified, but as far as we understand, are mainly tasked with improving nuclear weapons in various ways. And this, especially in my field, in physics and engineering, soaks up a huge plurality of the best graduates to work on these very handsomely funded projects, which benefit only sort of US military dominance and so on. So seeing sort of the same process unfolding in the UK is sort of, should be quite worrying to sort of anyone who's interested in public discourse about these things, or sort of in scientific and open research more generally.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, having sort of become politicized myself through going to university at a time when we were just having a Blair government that introduced tuition fees and abolished the grant, I kind of got very involved in education funding. And so at the time, you were like, the moment you start to put the burden of paying for education onto individuals, you've just completely destroyed that funding model. It's just completely unsustainable. And that's kind of why we're here, aren't we? As you say, there's an absolutely massive funding crisis where I think, is it 40% of institutions are now pretty much kind of bankrupt. So as you say, they're in this situation where they're sort of desperate for funding. But of course, again, this is completely unsustainable. So, it comes back to the whole thing of hundreds of billions are being funneled into military spending when it should be going into funding higher education, which is absolutely critical in terms of us being able to have a thriving competitive economy. Do you know what I mean? Like with the sort of the brightest and the best. So again, it's just a complete like own goal. But certainly in terms of CND, I mean, and this is a shout out to everybody on this call, is that we are, working with students and staff in universities to basically sort of coordinate protests outside, universities that have signed up to this, and to have them outside so that it means that students can link up with staff, but also with like campaigners and the local community, so that we're completely kind of united on this, because I think this is part of, as I say, this kind of whole of society mission to try and harness all of our like public institutions for war and militarism. And so they, like people have sort of said, they have very, very sort of profound implications in terms of what education is, what it's for, people's freedom of speech, all of that kind of stuff. So it's really important. So if there are people on this call who are at universities or students, please do put in the chat where you are, and so that we can contact you and build a really sort of strong movement against this, because as Rhys was saying, there's just overwhelming opposition to this. Why wouldn't there be? Okay, so we've got a couple more kind of questions which are not actually sort of to do specifically with sort of the research or kind of sort of nuclear weapons in Britain, but it's to do with the kind of the evolving situation in sort of the Middle East. So we've had a question which is around the fact that like as this this webinar started, I think Iran has sort of put out a statement saying that it kind of views the UK as a sort of a military target, which we knew that this was coming. There'd been discussion about this before, and this is because Britain has given permission for the use of its bases in RAF Fairford and Diego Garcia, hiding behind any responsibility for this by saying, oh, they're just being used defensively, when it's absolutely clear that that's not the case at all. And we know, for instance, that already at RAF Fairford that a B-1 bomber took off on Tuesday from that base and carried out a wide-ranging bombing mission on Iran. So that is kind of already happening. So it's basically like, what impact could this potentially have on Britain? We know that there are military bases in the Middle East as well. Certainly in Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates, we've got bases, but obviously we've got bases in Cyprus. So yes, just sort of comment on that. And then the other question is the fact that the US is now in the process, or has kind of sort of signed up this deal with Saudi Arabia to say that it's going to facilitate Saudi Arabia being able to potentially kind of enrich its own uranium to be able to have civilian nuclear power in a situation where obviously the US has been illegally bombing Iran, and arguing that whilst I'm sure most of us will not support nuclear power, but within the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, signatories do have the right to develop civilian nuclear power. And we know that part of the US's kind of demands is that Iran should not be allowed to enrich uranium at all, or have any kind of civilian nuclear power. So so just really kind of looking at those kind of differing approaches by the US, but also the sort of the kind of growing threats from this illegal war on Iran, and where you kind of think that's going. So I'm gonna come to Lynn. Is that all right if I come to you first?
Yeah, I mean, as you said, Iran is perfectly rationally making this association because it's real, because the United Kingdom is complicit in the US strategy, and I believe will remain so until we have leaders who are not enamored with nuclear weapons, because it all goes back to that link. There's no possibility of the UK having a nuclear weapon system without dependence on the United States. And as long as they think that that's what we need, as long as they fool themselves into this kind of magical thinking, we'll have this relationship and get involved in all kinds of scurrilous nonsense on the behalf of the United States. And yes, the nuclear enrichment deal is being seen in the United States as strange because it doesn't require the same limitations and promises to allow inspections as an earlier deal entered into with the United Arab Emirates, and is seen as deliberately provocative, even I think within people who otherwise would go along with a lot of what Trump is doing. It's very strange, and it's just naked, presumably commercial desire, and perhaps deliberately provocative. But it's difficult for us as a peace movement to argue against any rights to nuclear power, because, as you say, it's enshrined in the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But I basically think that is a terrible wrong, and it was from the very beginning a sort of fig leaf to try and cover over the harms of nuclear weapons, and has to be unpicked. But we're very far from there at the moment.
Thanks. Okay, I'm going to go to Hugh now. If you've got anything that you wanted to add, any thoughts on that situation?
Well, maybe just briefly, I suppose, yeah, especially over the past year or so, the US has become sort of more belligerent overseas. It does drag the other NATO members into riskier situations. And that's sort of my understanding of some of what's going on in the Middle East at the minute. And it's something, that obviously is, there's talk of these actions sort of fracturing the alliance, but it's sort of difficult to sort of imagine how something has been so sort of calcified for so long could be kind of pulled apart fully. So yeah, it's difficult to say exactly what this will come to. I'm sure the other speakers would have a sort of slightly more informed perspective on this.
Calcified is right. Rhys.
Yeah, I agree with what Lynn and Hugh said. It's just absolutely bonkers, isn't it? The American and Israeli aggression against Iran and like what that has led to and where it's all going. And then to see the deal with Saudi Arabia today, I feel like I'm living in the upside down. It's just wild. I think the two things that stood out for me from what I read about the deal was that Saudi Arabia won't sign up to and implement the International Atomic Energy Agency's additional protocols and like really strong safeguards agreements to ensure that their nuclear facilities are safe and there's not a proliferation risk there. So that really stood out. The fact that Saudi Arabia had come to this agreement with the US and there was no kind of aspects of the agreement, meaning that Saudi Arabia needed to recognize the state of Israel or like sign the Abraham Accords or whatever. And that seems to have changed like recent, like, I heard the news in the morning and it was saying, oh, this hasn't happened. And then I think developments over the course of the day has been like, okay, now Trump is saying this deal will only go through if Saudi Arabia does these things. But it's just absolutely wild that this is happening at a time when the American administration is striking Iran because of its desire to enrich uranium. And yeah, the whole thing is just beyond belief. And I think it's illuminating for us as people that want nuclear disarmament, because you've clearly seen like one of the world's nuclear superpowers brought to the negotiating table by a state that has been, massively militarily and like societally hit by missiles and conventional weapons, but it's managed to bring the US to its knees to the negotiating table because of it can shut the Strait of Hormuz. And it's like, okay, do you really need nuclear weapons if this is the kind of thing that can happen by, more conventional means? And I don't, I, my thoughts on Iran are very hard to structure beyond like, it's just absolute insanity that no one benefits from. And I think it would be Trump's Vietnam, right?
Mm. Yeah, catastrophic. No, that's very helpful. I mean, I think that certainly from what I've been following is that the sort of the background to the US Saudi deal is that that Saudi Arabia has already sort of signed an agreement with Pakistan, um, sort of a defense agreement, but also, was potentially a nuclear element within that, and that the US was wanting to keep, its influence, you know what I mean, within the region. And so therefore it was like, okay, we'll promise you the, nuclear enrichment, therefore others can't do the same thing. But I think for me, I feel like this just shows that the US is all about driving nuclear proliferation. Do you know what I mean? Like if it's kind of in its interest, it will kind of do that. But also across the world, if you look at like the situation in Asia Pacific, where the US like has been putting pressure on Japan for a very long time now to basically overturn its nuclear principles, that it will not host nuclear weapons, that it will not, transport nuclear weapons, and it will not, station nuclear weapons. And the US wants to be able to use Japan's, naval bases in order to be able to station its nuclear weapons, its nuclear submarines there. And so you've now got a situation where, the country that was bombed by, with nuclear weapons by the United States is now in this position where it's going to be potentially kind of, overturning this absolutely kind of fundamental policy of non-nuclear status. So yes, so it does kind of show like this is a kind of reality. And as you say, the idea that kind of nuclear weapons keep us safe is a sort of the complete opposite. But also I think that the situation around Iran is really kind of, it is kind of catastrophic. But I think that the US is clearly not finished. Do you know what I mean? I think, there's a lot of discussion about this is going to be a very, very, very long war. We know that the overall goal of the United States is for regime change in Iran. It wants to completely reconfigure the Middle East. And so, this is a very sort of serious and potentially kind of very long drawn out conflict that is going to have, profound impacts on the whole kind of global economy and and beyond. So yeah, so I'm just going to do a plug here, which is that CND is organising a demonstration at RAF Fairford on Saturday, the 15th of August, and that's because we are completely obviously opposed to this massive escalation. We're completely opposed to the use of British bases. We're calling on Burnham to do the right thing. And rather than, going along with Starmer, who basically sort of rubber stamped this sort of, the use of British bases on his last day in office, we're saying, you can't be going along with supporting illegal wars. So, anybody who can make it to Fairford, which is in the Cotswolds on Saturday the 15th, do please join us, because it will be a really, really excellent and very, very important demonstration. All right then.
Can I just do a quick plug on the 8th of August? I mean, there'll be lots of local events on the 6th and the 9th, but on the 8th we are going to be at Faslane, at the north gate of Faslane, between 12 and 2, if anyone wants to join us, just to have a presence there during that very critical period. And there's always a religious event at Faslane as well. I think that's slightly earlier in the month, but if anybody's interested, they can contact Scottish CND for details. And just, Sophie, there's a couple of notes here asking about, in the chat and the Q&A, asking about leaflets and suggesting, that there's excellent material. Or you want to say something about that? I mean, we would certainly want to try to do both Kate Ramsden and Robert Andrews' comments. We would hope to try to respond to.
Yeah. So it's basically like, how can you take this quite complex research, let's be honest, and turn it into something that's accessible, that you could like have on a leaflet and all of that sort of thing. And I suppose I feel like there's levels, aren't there, in terms of you can have something that's pretty kind of top line, but then really, then can there be a next layer, which is, a lot more information, because I think that's important too, in terms of people kind of getting all the granular information and sort of understanding it. So let's us, CND and Scottish CND talk about that, because yeah.
Well, also just to say that Hugh very kindly offered to write something for the National. So this Saturday, hopefully Hugh will have a piece in the National based on this work. I mean, they only take 800 words, so he's not going to manage to get it all in. But anyway, it's very good of him to have done that.
Yeah.
And thanks so much for the opportunity to do that as well. And no, I'd be happy to coordinate to see how it could be the work could be more effectively communicated in sort of more dense formats,
That would be amazing. Yeah, that would be really, really fantastic, because we've had a lot of interest in this webinar. People want to understand this. And so it is really important, isn't it, in terms of being able to kind of get out on a really like a mass level, but also to be able to give people the opportunity to really kind of dig deep into the research too. Yeah, that would be amazing. All right then. Well, we've sort of come to the end of our webinar now. I want to thank so much our amazing speakers. Really, really so much information, as I say, and really, really important, very, very important research given the seriousness of the situation that we face. And as Lynn was saying, very soon we'll be commemorating the 81st anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But also, we're also in the struggle of trying to get compensation for nuclear test veterans. The MOD is still completely refusing to admit that there is any, correlation between the fact that these, men were exposed to, tens of nuclear explosions, and the fact that they've, developed terrible cancers, leukemias, and, their families have for generations. So it shows like how critical this work is to sort of show the absolute horror and reality of nuclear weapons, not just in terms of them being, the huge attacks and the destructive power, but also the radioactive fallout, and how profoundly that impacts people's lives going forward. So thank you very much. Thank you to everybody who's been on this webinar for all your amazing questions and also your brilliant contributions. And I'm sorry we weren't able to kind of read out all of them, but we will really try and capture a lot of these kind of ideas to sort of progress this work. So thank you very much, and all take care of yourself. See you soon.
Thanks.